Welcome to the Australian Property Investment Podcast, where we tackle the big questions in property investing. Our guests are industry experts, and we're fortunate to pick their brains on the challenges that investors often encounter when growing their property portfolio. Welcome to the Australian Property Investment Podcast. Let's start investing. G'day everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Australian Property Investment Podcast. I'm your host, Aaron Christie David, and I run a mortgage broking business called Atelier Wealth, where we specialise in helping property investors start out and scale up their property portfolio. And a big part of your scalability is having the ability to pull out equity and go again, so match with borrowing capacity. Without equity though, becomes an Achilles heel for investors. So that's one of the big topics that we want to talk about today. But before we do kick off, I just want to reiterate that this is a chat that's general in nature and not intended to give advice. If you do need advice, please do seek out a qualified professional to do so. Jeremy Sheppard, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me here.
Pleasure to be here. We're having a little bit of a chinwag beforehand and learning a little bit about you. So we'll go into a little bit about yourself and DSR Data in a minute, but I want to rewind the clock back for our listeners, maybe who haven't heard of you or haven't come across DSR Data as well, to learn a little bit about you and your journey. I think the real part that probably stands out in your journey is that you've been an investor since 2002. And then I guess fast forward 20 years and time in the market's going to tell us some wonderful things about the ups, downs, sideways steps about becoming an investor. So that's something that I'm really excited to have a chat about, talk about what you do, how you do it with your platform called DSR Data as well. And I think having, I think as we move to more tech-based support for investors, I think this is something that's going to be something that really probably strikes a chord with a lot of investors as well, mate. So to kick us off, I start with what they call the 3 Ps. So a bit about yourself personally, professionally, and your own property journey as well, if you want to share what you're comfortable to.
Right. Well, personally, I got into investing. Actually, I was into share investing before I got into real estate.
Yeah.
I was dismal at both to begin with. So I found myself in my early 30s with practically nothing, no money, no savings, no assets.
Right.
Well, I did have a car, which
don't count as an asset.
No, liability. I sold it for $675. So
yeah, right.
Yeah, that's how
so
much
someone
of an
else took that
asset
liability off your hands. Yeah.
I realised I was way behind the 8 ball, had to catch up. So I learned everything I could about investing in shares.
Right.
And got a little more disciplined with my savings.
Yeah.
And lost a fair bit of money, realising I didn't know what I was doing with shares.
Yeah. So you paid the dumb tax.
Yeah. Smarter now. But had to pay that tax. And then I bought my first property in 2002.
Yeah.
And I think I was just lucky in that Sydney at the time, which is where I bought, was going through a boom. In fact, most of the nation was going through a tremendous boom around the early 2000s. And I renovated that property. I had a nightmare tenant. I made a lot of mistakes. All the wiser now. But somehow I don't credit that wisdom. I wish I could not have made those mistakes. But over the next 7 years, I purchased 16 investment properties across Australia, New Zealand. I was heading off to the US. I put a deposit down on a couple of properties there. Yeah. And then they had this thing called the subprime lending crisis.
Absolutely.
And my mortgage broker said, you can't get anything. So, that was another disaster, another setback. I've recovered since, and I have a much smaller and more manageable portfolio now, and I'm far less aggressive in my property investing. And I think that's probably the biggest mistake I made. I was just overambitious, looking for the best possible finance, the fastest capital growth, the biggest yields. And when you push the boundaries like that, I've learned made a lot of mistakes, learned a lot of lessons.
I guess there's growth and then there's aggressive growth, and that does maybe come at an expense perhaps because you're making fast decisions or you're maybe compromising what you probably initially thought to set out. And we'll see this from time to time where people have got great ambitions or great aspirations. They want the quick win, and sometimes they say the longest route is the shortcut, perhaps.
Yeah, that's a good quote. And I think it was because I had in the back of my mind that I was starting late and that I had nothing. I had to catch up, so I had to do something radical. But if I had just been a little bit more methodical and routine about investing, I still had enough time.
Yeah.
So
take me through what some of the, I don't want to kind of open up some old wounds here, for example, but off the top of your head, what's some of the, you'd say these are the really, I wouldn't say bad decisions, but
sure, one of them was you can do as much research on location and the asset as you like, but if you have not researched the tenant and let's say that the property is already fitted with one, you can inherit a real disaster there. And that's something I didn't do from get-go.
Just to that point, I mean, I think there's one person in the team that gets overlooked, which is the property manager. I'm like, the property manager should be called your asset manager. And that's a big part of their role is effectively vetting a great tenant from a bad tenant, which causes some issues there as well. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, well, you think about a hotel manager. If you are the owner of that hotel, you have hired, the best manager that money can find. And you're in touch with them all the time. And it's the same with real estate. You are running a hospitality business. But a lot of investors just think, oh, you want to park your money there and then you just want to collect your rent and get some equity growth. But you are running a business. And property managers are so underappreciated.
So true.
There's an enormous amount of turnover. They've always got someone complaining. It's either the tenant or the owner.
Exactly.
It's a terrible job, really, for what they get paid.
Turnover and it's usually an entry point into property. You start.
That's
in
right.
Real estate agency, you start in the property management side, cut your teeth, turnover, and you're right. That's one aspect of investing that I continually just say to people is like, don't shake down your property manager from I don't know, whatever percentage they're charging. They're protecting your great asset here. Spend a little bit more and get a good quality, high caliber property manager.
Yeah. So this first tenant that I had, they didn't pay any rent from the moment I purchased the property onwards. And it took something, I think it was about 5 months to get them out. And the day before the sheriff was to turn up and physically evict them, they left. But before they did, they blocked up all the drains, left the taps running overnight and flooded the property. And this was my first experience with property investing. And at the time, so I'd bought a house with a granny flat. And the tenants were in the granny flat whilst I was renovating the house. Because the granny flat was relatively new, but the house was dated. I wanted to add some instant equity by renovating. The tradies said to me, Jeremy, we're not continuing with this project any further until you get rid of those tenants because they're stealing our stuff. So I was forking out money for a mortgage. I was getting no rent. I was paying tradies who had just I'd committed to a contract, and then they just said no more until you get rid of them, and I couldn't get rid of them. And then when they left, they trashed the place, and the insurer they said, "Oh, Jeremy, we believe you've mismanaged this property. This is your fault. We'll give you a couple of $1,000, and you should be grateful and just walk away." Fun times.
That might be the straw that broke the camel's back for a lot of other first-time investors. You've gone on to go,
I take my mind back to that, and I think that should have had me depressed. And pulling my hair out, but I just can't picture that. I can picture myself sitting on the freshly polished floorboards after the renovation was complete, had an agent come in, give me a market appraisal, and I couldn't believe the figure that he suggested this property would be worth. And the valuation came in at exactly that figure. I was like, fist pumping. It works. It works. But it took me about a decade to realise that it wasn't my renovation that created all this equity. It was just that boom that Sydney was in the middle of. I could have been sitting on my hands enjoying my life and gaining equity through just time. And it took me a hell of a lot more renovations and more mistakes to realise the power of capital growth, just
Yeah.
sitting on your hands, collecting wealth.
Yeah, nice one. And yeah, we'll come to capital growth in a minute. I think you've just touched on, which is when you go to renovate, I think we've got a little bit better at as having figures in terms of how much percentage you should spend on a bathroom or a cosmetic reno, for example. And I think the tendency to overcapitalize on a renovation we see from time to time as well. I've personally done it. Out renovated the market to the point that I was like, trouble selling the property because it was overly renovated for the demographics for the area, right? They didn't want the subway tiles in the kitchen, just needed something basic. So yeah, I can feel that to a certain degree as well. So property one, a bit of brain damage with it, overcome, and then you start to scale up your portfolio. So obviously the equity play, and that's something that I guess when you and I had a chat before, a lot of, and again, no criticisms intended, a lot of buyers agents are really pushing the cash flow side when we get, clients that are going to go buyers agents, cash flow. I'm like, well, hang on. You're on a 6-figure salary here. The extra $100 a week isn't really going to change your life, is it? But I guess it's tangible and they can bank it. It helps with serviceability. Right. But when you said, hey, mate, I only buy for cash, for capital growth, I was like, hello, now we're talking, because equity, pull it out, go again. Like that's the only way that you're actually going to springboard and scale up. So
yeah, and the amazing thing is when you look at the difference in extremely good cash flow properties and extremely good capital growth properties, and how it changes your net wealth position, it's chalk and cheese. But I understand. I had the same attitude when I started. In order for me to retire, all I need is how many of these sort of cash flow positive properties. But I never really asked myself the question, well, how do you get the next one and the one after that?
Correct.
And that comes from the equity gain. But the amazing thing is that the equity gain from capital growth, obviously it's demand exceeding supply. That also influences the rents. So ironically, the fastest way to a cash flow positive retirement ready portfolio is through massive capital growth rather than just trying to acquire cash flow positive properties from the get-go.
Yeah, well said. So is that again one of those things in hindsight you look back going, I wish I had a clear mandate that I'm really pushy on capital growth, or was it you compromise because you try to get the best of both worlds? And that's what, again, we're talking to clients going, one has probably got to exceed the other. Is it capital growth or is it cash flow? Because when you're trying to buy both, you're probably buying middle of the road stuff as well. Right?
Yeah. Well, I think something you said before about it's tangible. The yield is tangible. And like I now know I should have been pursuing capital growth back then, but I had no idea what I should be looking for. And that took a long time of looking at a lot of property data. And now I consider myself an expert in the topic of capital growth and property data and so on. But back then, what was tangible to me was the yield. And I had no idea how to pick a location for capital growth. And so I tried to manufacture equity through the renovations. So, I think, what you said, tangible. Yield is tangible.
Correct. So when you now say, I look at data, what data are you looking at? And we call it data. Do you consider yourself a data scientist these days? Or what's it?
No. I've been mistaken for a data scientist.
It's like the greatest buzzword there is, right, at the moment.
I know enough about data science to get myself in real trouble. So I've played around in Python and a few libraries and so on. So I did work in IT for a while. But I outsource any data science work, which I'm doing right now, and it's costing me a fortune, but it's money well spent. So when I first started looking at the data, back in the day there used to be property investment magazines.
I subscribe to it.
And I used to always look at the pages at the back, look at all the data, and I think, what does this mean? What is this metric auction clearance rate? I'm trying to picture what the nature of a market is.
Columns and columns of data.
Well, in the end, I realised, I think it was late 2009, the penny dropped for me about the law of supply and demand. what I should be looking for is metrics of supply, metrics of demand, and then I found sources for this kind of data Australia-wide, and put my IT experience to use and started acquiring all this data, came up with an algorithm, the demand to supply ratio, and this is Australia-wide. And I just had a sneaking suspicion this is going to work really well. And I remember it was January 2010, and they actually got published. These figures got published in the Australian Property Investor magazine. When it was back in print then. And before it got published, I remember contacting two agents. A set of agents. Airlie Beach units in Airlie Beach in Queensland had the lowest demand to supply ratio, and I contacted a few agents and I asked them what's going on up there, and they said, "Oh, Jeremy, come up here. We'll pay for your flight. We'll roll out the red carpet. You've got so much to choose from." They treated me like royalty. Then there was the other end of the spectrum. It was Heathcote in the Sutherland Shire, houses in Heathcote, and no agent would even return my call. One emailed me back saying, "I'll put you on the list, Jeremy, and let you know when something pops up." And so I knew this thing works. There's something in it. I'm looking at the broadest polar opposite ends of the spectrum, and it is showing there's an oversupply in one area and there's an undersupply in the other. There's high demand in one, low supply. And, over the years it's turned out that it's worked pretty well.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah.
That almost takes me back to that scene in The Big Short where they're driving around and there's all those houses for sale. I'd say they're very motivated to sell. And so you talk about the supply at that time versus the demand. And that's something that comes to mind. I always laugh at that scene.
Steve Carell.
I'd say they're very motivated. And so I think, you're probably seen, you're taking the data, had a look at it, put it into real life and go, I can actually see that this has got merits, for example. And then you've taken that and now I guess in time bottled that essence and going, right, here's a platform that investors can come on to help themselves cherry pick the data that they want to have a look at and then go, so take us through is this the birth of DSR data and who does it serve? Yeah,
so that was the birth of, DSR Data, the website, didn't actually get created until 2015.
Okay.
But the algorithm, the demand to supply ratio, that was around in January 2010.
Wow.
And since then, I've acquired a lot more data, a lot more metrics, gained a lot more experience from the history as to what's happened. And we're putting that into practice right now. We hope to have version 3 out in September, maybe August, fingers crossed.
Okay.
But 2015, I came out with version 2, which I called the DSR Plus, and that's with the website DSR Data. And it's a do-it-yourself website for your research. Yeah. It was always designed just to be a shortlisting tool. Okay. Here are some suburbs, do some further research. Here's a good start. And since then, it's become I don't do much more research now beyond what the algorithm tells me. In fact, in the past, I have tried to. So every now and then, I've been asked by journalists or what's your top 10, Jeremy, for Australia for the next 12 months? And I've looked at what the algorithm has given me. I've scratched a couple, come up with my own list, and they've actually underperformed the top 10 that the algorithm just picked out. Right. I think it's time for me to say I don't actually know. Yeah. Let's leave the big machine to do its job and trust that it's been designed well and works well. Yeah. And if you give it enough data, good data, obviously you put garbage in, you get garbage out. Yes. Then it's impossible for a human being to get to every auction, thousands of auctions.
And then there's confirmation bias that comes with a human.
Yeah, the subjectivity in what we're
like, what do I value versus what the next individual values, and they put a slant on that.
And then looking at say 30 years of historical data, I mean that exceeds my experience in property investing. So we are at an age now where it is hard to accept, but sooner or later we're going to have to say, the algorithm is smarter than us, and we have to take what it picks. But of course, I always check. I just I want to talk to someone on the ground and know for sure.
Yeah, and I think that's the most important part, like having the ability to talk to someone. People can lean on the tech. Well, I think what we call in our business is high tech and high touch. So people want to have the access to the tech tools, but then always maybe run that by another human. Just go, what do you think? And maybe stress test it that way as well. So I think there is a place for technology, and there's a place for the human touch and the human element as well, right?
Sure.
Yeah. One thing we spoke about earlier, which I think was an interesting point, which is when you deal with people. And so, I mean, the way that your platform works, people come on, they'll pay effectively a subscription, so access to the data. And then I understand that buyer's agents will then get access to your data as well. So effectively you can shop where buyer's agents shop for their data as well if you want to go down that path of a DIY investor. So you've got three options, I think, with an investor. DIY, so I'll do it all myself and I won't pay a buyer's agent. Do it together, so done with you. So you may pay for a course, for example, or a smaller engagement fee, but not the whole hog, or done for you, which is paying a buyer's agent to pretty much take this whole thing off, this monkey off my back and go from start to finish for the property acquisition, right?
Yeah. We have a range of customers. It's hard to tell what each one is, but I definitely know we have a significant number of buyers agents that use the data. And there are plenty of people who will contact those buyers agents and they'll ask me, look, Jeremy, I don't want to do all this research. Have you got a buyer's agent that you could recommend? Yeah. So so long as they start with good data, and it's not just my data either. Like I can remember in 2010 when I was trying to sell this algorithm, people were very risk averse.
I'd say it's almost ahead of its time, isn't it? 2010 to sell an algorithm.
It was. Yeah. And I can remember in 2008, Australian Property Investor magazine, they used to come out with this Hot 100. Yes. And Domain had an algorithm, and they had their hot suburbs in this Hot 100, and they were terrible. A year later, they came last in the rankings.
Did, or
Domains, Domains, and never heard from them again. And so this is in people's minds too, that algorithms are just rubbish. Statistics are lies. So it was very hard for me back then. But now there's like a plethora of algorithms, and there's a lot of buyers agents who are doing their own algorithms. They're hiring data scientists. So there are more data scientists getting in. And at first I thought, this is competition for me. I don't like it. But actually it's been good for the industry because now buyers, like investors, are seeing that everyone's got an algorithm. It's all heading AI. Everyone knows about ChatGPT, and that's just made people a lot more open-minded to what this can deliver. And so, I don't see them so much as competition now. I mean, they aren't friends, but they have certainly helped.
Co-opetition, perhaps? So there's a bit of cooperation and competition.
Co-opetition, yeah.
I'll let you use that one. Yeah.
Thanks. Is that yours, though?
I think I just made that up. That's my degree in marketing coming into play right there.
Co-opetition, I like it.
Yeah, there you go. Thanks. Yeah, so it's the way we coexist, but a bit of healthy competition. One of the, and when I did some research, for example, on I guess your track record and what you've put out there, I won't say unpopular beliefs, but you go kind of myth busting, for example. And I think these are some of I've even held on to a couple of these, for example, personally. So one myth is you buy and you never sell, especially your first investment property. And I think when Bernadette, my wife, was like, we've got to sell that property. It's doing nothing. I was like, you never sell your first investment. And the arm wrestle, needless to say, I lost that arm wrestle, but I think that's one thing that we're kind of led to believe, and you've kind of gone, well, hang on, I don't think that needs to be the source of truth.
When I was learning everything I could about property investing, that was what was taught to me. You buy and never sell.
Yes.
And just having access to all this data over the years and having time to research, what I've realised is that most property markets, they have this growth spurt. It might only be 3 years, and then they're flat for quite a long period of time. Now, if an investor gets in the market just before that growth spurt, the ideal time, they are in this ideal position after the market has peaked to sell and reallocate those funds elsewhere. And you're thinking, well, gee, I've got to pay capital gains tax on all this growth that I've had. I've got to pay an agent a big commission. Then I've got to pay stamp duty to buy elsewhere. Yeah. Surely that can't be a good idea. But there are property markets around the country at any time when you think it's time to buy, when you're ready to buy, there is a good opportunity where that property market is looking at double-digit growth for the next few years. Yeah. And the market that you have bought in recently and has peaked is looking at flatlining for the same period of time. Right. So although it defies logic, if the numbers stack up, it actually works. I mean, we've all heard of a renovation flip going wrong, but renovation flips can work. People have done it and they've made a lot of money out of it, and it all comes down to, do the numbers add up? So the simplest equation is, we call it recycling costs. The cost to sell your property, paying CGT, paying an agent their commission, legal fees, then to pay stamp duty, more legal fees to re-enter the market. We call that recycling costs. Okay. We offset that, compare that against what's called opportunity costs. There's a better property market somewhere in the nation compared to where you currently hold a property. Yeah. So the simple equation is, if opportunity costs exceed recycling costs, then you should sell with a comfortable margin for error. If recycling costs are higher than opportunity costs, then you should stay put. And so it just comes down to doing those numbers. And there are a surprising number of properties around the country where investors should actually be selling, and they will be better off. Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's. I think it kind of flips it on its head, which is exactly that. Most of the costs, I think, then become prohibitive to sell out, or it's like, hey, if I sell out now, what am I going to do to get back into the market, for example, as well? Some clients are forced to sell. That analysis where I say it's case by case basis. Yeah. If you owned a property for something like, say, 20 years, it's probably doubled in value twice in that period of time. So the CGT that you're going to be paying on exit will probably result in that equation saying hold. And I've done this analysis for that first property that I bought in 2002. And it pretty much always comes up as a hold. Okay. But stuff that I've bought more recently, that'll be a sell. So it's more like a trading mindset then at that stage. Yeah, and this. I think that it's because we've now got this technology where we can forecast a little more accurately. Yeah. If we didn't know, even just 10 years ago, how are these two markets going to perform, then the best advice is to stay put. So I still don't think it was bad advice back then. It's just this is the change that AI has brought to yet another industry. Yeah, well said. Well said. Some of the other ones I think I did read was always buy close to shopping centres, hospitals, amenities, public transport, for example. And it's like those are your star performers as well, and you're kind of here to blow that wide open. Yeah, I did some research on this is on long-term growth. So suburbs that have a train station, I think I did Sydney only versus suburbs that don't. And looking at it over 30 years, surely you'd see more capital growth with that amenity than without. And no, I did the same for shopping centres, good schools, beaches, airports. Okay. And it's almost as if there's no amenity that, if it's been there for the long term, can have a long-term impact on capital growth. And one of the best analogy I can give for why this is the case is I call it the apples and oranges analogy. So picture yourself 100 years ago, you walk into a fruit shop, apples cost 1 cent, oranges cost 2 cents. Yeah. Now, if oranges outgrow, they have a faster growth rate in their price than apples. Let's say they grow at 8%. Yeah. Whilst apples only grow at 4%. After 100 years, you would be spending 50 cents to buy an apple. So it's gone from 1 cent to 50 cent with a 4% per annum growth rate. Okay. An 8% per annum growth rate for oranges, if they started at 2 cents, they would cost $44 for a single orange. Okay. Now picture yourself walking into the fruit shop and you've got a choice. Well, do I buy an apple for 50 cents? Yeah. Or an orange for $44. You can buy 88 apples. It's still an apple and it's still an orange. Yeah. So it's still got the train station, the good schools, the proximity to work and shops and so on. It's change. Change changes the capital growth rate. You cannot have a property market outperform over the long term because eventually it becomes so expensive compared to the affordable options that buyers walk into the fruit shop and they say, oh, I'm not going to buy any oranges. I'm going to, well, apples look affordable, don't they? And that accelerates the price growth of apples because there's now more demand for them. It reduces the growth rate for oranges because there's less demand for them. So you hear real estate agents talk about, oh, this area will be always in demand because it is so lovely. It's got all the desirable features. But that's not the demand that we're interested in for capital growth. You know, a teenage boy might want a Ferrari. That's not the demand that's going to affect the price of Ferraris because they can't walk into a showroom and slap down $250,000 and say, I want one. And they don't have a license either. Probably shouldn't be behind the wheel. So the demand that pushes prices is putting your hand up at auction, making an offer. And people can't do that if property is too expensive. So these areas that do have everything, that may have a good surge in growth, will eventually get to a point where they're too expensive and people look for affordable options. And one of the most remarkable discoveries I've made in the last looking at the last 30 years of data, is there is a tendency for all property markets to grow at the same rate over the long term. So there's no long-term outperformance. It's over the short term that there is, and that's what investors should be targeting. Despite it being ingrained in our education, property is a long-term investment. Yeah, it is, but it's made up of a bunch of short-term investments. It's what's going to happen right now. And if you can get into the market with a good dose of capital growth in the next couple of years, that gives you a quick buffer. If you lose your job, you have to sell, at least you'll get some of that equity back. It won't waste all that stamp duty that you paid. Yeah.
I can almost preempt some of the questions I'd get off the back of that if I shared that particular example. So we use the example of apples and oranges, and you take oranges being a more premier or highly priced, and you go, well, hang on, we've got areas like Toorak, Mossman, Ascot, for example, up in Brizzy, and they're always highly sought, highly aspirational areas, so they won't go out of vogue, perhaps. And then you got the apples, and we'll call those more emerging areas, for example, in the burbs, and you go, well, isn't Coogee, isn't Mossman, isn't Ascot, Toorak, aren't they always going to be high performers given that they've got a huge amount of, I guess, popularity, demand, lower supply because those areas are kind of built out, for example. So have you looked at that? Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's really easy to do this analysis. Yeah. And certainly over the 30 years that I've looked at, I've only have access to 30 years of historical data. And this is another issue. There's not much. The data age is relatively new. So things like auction clearance rates, they don't date back 30 years. So I've analysed like Mossman versus Mount Druitt in Sydney. Over 30 years, nothing in it. And there will always be, one peculiar thing I've noticed after analysing literally hundreds, maybe even thousands of charts, growth charts, comparing two markets. It might be Sydney versus Launceston or Mount Druitt versus Mossman. There's this, no one market just gets ahead of the other and continues to outperform it. Instead, the second market always catches up, and there's these pinch points in the curves where the two curves meet or even cross over. So one starts outperforming the other, and it always gets caught up. So, and this is the whole affordability thing. Right? Let's say in that analogy I was saying oranges are your Mossmans and apples are your Mount Druitt. Sure. Because oranges just get way too expensive and because apples look so affordable by comparison, people are drawn to what's cheaper. So we do all we all want a multi-million-dollar house in Point Piper, but we can't all afford it. So there's a difference between wishful thinking and the demand that pushes prices up. So it really doesn't matter what demographic or what the suburb has. Over the long term, there is a tendency for all property markets to grow at the same rate.
Yeah, okay.
And that was a startling discovery. And there was an amazing.
It really blows that wide open, because that's you'd hold on to that going, surely the suburb outperforms another suburb based on its.
And there's this concept of like investment grade suburbs,
Yes,
like
100%.
that.
Yep.
And yet the data shows, and even investment grade properties.
Yeah.
So some more analysis I did was the variation in prices for different properties within the same suburb. So you might have a $400,000 house and a $500,000 house.
Yeah.
So you've got that sort of 25% difference. Has that increased in percentage terms over the years? Because if there is such a thing as an investment grade property, it should. That gap should widen, but it's actually narrowed. And I suspect that's because, we have greater access to technology. We can do these comparative market analysis, and you can't get away with your lowball offers anymore. So if there was such a thing as an investment grade property within a suburb, you would see that gap widen. It hasn't happened. If there was such a thing as an investment grade property in a city, you would see the gap widen. It hasn't. And even cities, I mentioned Sydney versus Launceston.
Yeah.
There will be people who will do analysis, end-to-end analysis, say, over the last 20 years, Sydney has outperformed Launceston, for example. But then if you look at it over 10 years, it might be the complete opposite, or over 30 years. And that's because of these pinch points in the curve. Who wins the capital growth race is determined by where you set the start and finish dates.
Yeah, nice.
Because of that crossover and pinch points.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's amazing, really.
I love it. Yeah, it's you can probably hear my mind racing with questions. So I almost feel like we're gonna have to get you back on at some point, and we go through almost like a live data, like in action.
I'd love to show some charts. Yeah, that'd be great.
I think that'd be fantastic, because hearing it is one thing, seeing it is going to be the next, and you almost do that example live, and you go, right, let's talk about these pinch points, and it's like, okay, because obviously people need to pay to get inside the data that you've got.
Yeah, well, I mean, you won't, those examples I was showing, you won't see that on DSR data.
Yeah, sure.
But I can share them. It's freely available sort of stuff on my blogs, actually, on that expert busting series.
Let's have a look.
Yeah,
we'll pop that out there as well. So, mate, I think we could. Yeah, I think there's more juice left to squeeze out of your brain at some point. So I'm going to say we're going to get you back on and I think go down a little bit deeper. And again, I think this whole myth busting thing is, again, when we get clients that are just like, I'm adamant, and you can't blame people because they've just been conditioned to pick up on what people are putting down with these ideas or some of these messages. Got to buy near the beach, for example. And we live on the South Coast. We live on the South Coast. It's like, you've got to buy in this particular area, this corridor on this side of the highway to get the best capital growth. And it's like, well, is that the case? It's version 2.0.
Well, that is over the long term. So there are eras where, for example, another one of the myths is you buy close to the CBD.
Yeah.
And depending on where you set the start and finish points of that capital growth analysis, it could look like close to the CBD works, but then you just stretch that out, say another 5 years, and it's a completely different story. And that's because of these pinch points in the curves.
Yeah. Awesome. Jeremy, I want to say thank you very much. You've been
thank you,
mate, just oozing with knowledge, and I think that comes from personal but also professional insights as well, mate. So I want to say thank you very much. If you've found that helpful, we'll include the details for DSR data or your contact details if you do want to reach out as well. And I think, if you have that inclination to kind of roll your sleeves up and have a look at some data, you're going to get a lot of info out of that as well. So really exciting episode. Thanks very much for being on and sharing your knowledge and wisdom, mate. It's one of the beauties of what we do with this podcast, is getting access to someone like this where you may not have been able to, but someone else that's willing to share their knowledge and their insights. That's what the foundation of this podcast is built on. So I want to say thank you very much for listening and your time as well. I hope you've found that helpful. And until next time, take care.